in children's childhood for two reasons. Number one, that is the stage where they're most impressionable and receptive to external messaging, where they perceive those around them as having the largest degree of authority, and therefore these narratives influence individuals and inculcate individuals the most. Number two, this makes all further propaganda, e.g. workplace obedience, obedience to your country, loyalty to your government, significantly easier to propagate. And therefore, because this is the main context where this narrative influences people, this ought to be the center of the round. The claim we're going to make is that teachers and parents will enforce discipline in really terrible ways that traumatize children, and also this will not be ineffective, as children will not really adhere to disciplines, but rather exhibit further rebellious behavior that contradicts the messaging they get from those with authority. First burden then, why will teachers and parents do this badly? So this looks like teachers and parents telling children to just stay quiet, don't ask too many questions, follow orders, because the adults know what's best for them, to view children interacting with each other or exhibiting certain behaviors of pattern that some might view distractive or different or special from other people as things that are just wrong and make them bad individuals. The first reason is that this enables parents and teachers, or those with authority, to view their actions of discipline as legitimate and in the interest of the child. The media glorifies and justifies parental authority on their side of the house as a result of the narrative of discipline being something that we ought to pursue, which makes parents feel like they just know better than their children. They have the obligation and the right to discipline their children to ensure that they grow up to be good people, whereas on the comparative, it isn't necessarily clear that disciplining your child is in the best interest of them, and it's not socially glorified. Secondly, children are just less likely to speak out against parents as a result of discipline being something that's unquestionably glorified. So you shut down discussions regarding what's the appropriate screen time, for instance, or you shut down justifications when conversations occur between children and parents as to why what you're doing is wrong and how you ought to correct it, but rather default to the path of least resistance, which is the likely counterfactual on their side, of simply you have to obey to my orders because I know better and I know what's best for you. The second reason why they will do this badly is because parents and teachers, even if they don't themselves feel the need to do so, will feel a social obligation to make their children follow social etiquettes and be disciplined well, for instance. First of all, there will be the social expectation that you have to make your children follow rules, and if your children exhibit special or different forms of behavior within society, then you are the parent that's being irresponsible and doing bad parenting. So this will force you to consider what is best, what conforms most to these social obligations of discipline, and enforce discipline on your children, even if you don't want to do so and you know this might not be in the best interest of your child. Second of all, this uniquely causes more competition between parents because they want their child to be seen as the most disciplined one, as the most as the one that exists the most appropriate forms of behavior within the society, so that they're proud, so they're seen as perfect, because all parents want their children to be special, and therefore competition occurs on both sides. But the unique distinction is on their side, the single metric or an important metric all parents recognize is that of discipline, and therefore parents focus on heavily disciplining their child due to these social expectations, irrespective of whether this is in the best interest of their child and the specific traits of their child. Why is this then likely bad for children? First of all, parents are often conservative and have norms that are arbitrary and not likely to be in the interest of children, whereas where children are allowed to make their own decisions, for instance, they're more able to access liberal media, they're more able to access a diversity of opinions, versus on their side, the single parent or the single teacher has absolute control over what the child thinks, and therefore on their side of the house, you're likely to cause things like children being told that they cannot date someone of the same gender or of the different race. And these are things that not just damage the interests of the child and make them grow up to be worse people, but also make social structures generally more hierarchical and less equitable. Number two, children will internalize this poorly because when you glorify discipline, when you say that a child that does appropriate things is a good child and a child that does inappropriate things is a bad child, then you set up these black and white standards for children that says if you do this, you're a good person, if you do that, you're a bad person, and you should never strive to be a bad person. Because children are often not able to appreciate nuances within messaging, when you sort of tell children and signal to children that discipline is something we encourage, then children who do not conform to these norms of discipline will feel massive sense of inferiority, for instance. So that is bad for their future development as well, because their self-perception worsens massively on their side. Third of all, and this is crucial, you often do this in a way that significantly restricts children's freedom or provide them negative feedback, things like punishment, exclusion, etc. For the reason that this is the most effective, you cannot do positive feedback because number one, you cannot just always give positive feedback, because this just raises children's expectations, and they'll come back for like asking for more positive feedback. So you can't just like give children 1 extra hour of screen time for every good thing they're doing. Rather, children are most likely to care about restrictions on what they're already do, because children, like all humans in general, are risk averse and don't want to lose what they already have. So all of this punishment, all of this exclusion, for instance, when the teacher says that this is a bad kid and we need to discipline them, makes you less likely to have friends, makes you less likely to feel like you belong to the social circle, all of this causes lots of trauma and lots of pain for children. On the comparative, what occurs in many Western societies is that parents have the natural incentive to do what's best for their children. So speaking out, but on our side of the house, they only intervene in children's behavior in instances where it does cause substantial harm to children's interests. They often have to do things like convince the kid why they need to do this and justify the reason for their action. Before that, seal.
You narrow this debate down too much to authoritarian parenting. In super authoritarian cultures like China, conservative norms are going to exist anyway. Talk about this glorification more broadly, please.
Yeah, so none of the mechanisms I gave you are culturally dependent, right? The fact that parents wield massive authority over children is not culturally dependent. The fact that parents often have competition with each other and face social expectations is not culturally dependent. The final thing is, even if this doesn't do harm to children, we give you structural reasons why children will not listen to parental discipline. Number one, because lots of children exhibit such forms of behavior as a result of things they have no control over, like ADHD. So this hurts these children particularly when they live in a cycle of inferiority and when they're excluded and not accepted by their parents. Number two, you're unable to combat things like temptations and instant gratifications on both sides of the house. So often children commit these violations anyways, but parents punish them for it and they experience a large degree of pain. Number three is that this form of unhealthy relationship between parents and children often lead them to want to be rebellious, to stand up against that strong authority, and therefore worsens your relationship with parents. Because parental or teacher supervision can never be perfect, there's always a constant battle between teachers or parents and children, and therefore they do not actually exhibit the sort of benefits that opposition can possibly claim, but all they're left with is worsened self-perceptions and trauma. Very happy to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and now to open the opposition side of this debate, I call on the leader of the opposition. Here.
Hi everyone, just to reiterate, you can pronounce POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, winning on OG's best ground on the context of discipline being about parents. Secondly, on the correct debate, which is why glorification of discipline gives people incredible amounts of meaning in terms of personal development. Firstly, on the context of discipline that OG wants to win. This takes them at their best. Why is having discipline, particularly in the context they talk about like children with teachers and parents, just actively a good thing in these contexts? The first thing is just to say children do stupid shit. They often put themselves in harm's way, and oftentimes there's no direct way to explain to them why the things they're doing are terrible. And so it is easier to just, glorify the fact that you ought to always listen to your teachers in these instances. It also just probably makes managing a class far easier when a teacher, for example, is able to impose their authority in that way versus having to, try to navigate this, given the fact that, a lot of teachers are underpaid and a lot of like schooling systems are just not perfect. I think there just needs to be a direct mechanism to just control children. The second thing to point out is that discipline is often the only way to explain and instill good values in children when they and sort of like make them into good people, right? Children often don't have developed moral compasses. They don't know things like such as like pain or pleasure and like being empathetic towards other people. Oftentimes they act in selfish ways. You harm other children, you steal their toys. And obviously teachers will utilize discipline in these instances to, control that and protect other children as well and instill good values such as honesty, such as fairness in children. The third thing to point out is that sometimes I think agreeing to authority is just a good thing. Like sometimes you just need to suck up to authority. You need teachers to give you rec letters. You need to like climb up the social ladder in your workplace by sucking up to your boss in some instances. All of these things I think are just instances that can be used. Another thing is, right, the thing to point out is like a lot of these things apply when you're only a child, but obviously the influence of this narrative in the way that OG characterizes wanes out as you grow older, like as you meet other people, as you develop your own critical thinking skills, as you are still going to be like exposed to things like social media and liberalization, for example, intuitively in the status quo, that suggests that people are still able to break away from the worst forms of authority, which is the reason why even people in conservative countries can start rebelling and being independent from their parents. So I just don't think this makes a lot of sense as OG to be the tipping point of this debate. The final kicker is that surely even if you don't buy all of those responses, all of the harms that OG says, the clearest being sort of like your parents disagree with you being homosexual, are probably just symmetric if parents and authority can just use other narratives, such as the belief that you must always obey religious teachings, for example, or just conservative narratives that say this is unnatural. So I just think there's absolutely no delta on opening government and they cannot win this debate. So given that framing, given I've won on their arguments, what is the correct form of discipline that we talk about? We think the context of personal discipline is the one that is most predominant. That is discipline about self-control. It's about perseverance. It's about the mindset that you use when you approach your work and your goals, for example. Why is that the most likely context? I think, first of all, that is the easiest to glorify because it's a personal imposition, right? It doesn't come at the cost of other people. But secondly, it is also the most direct internalization, whereby OG's narrative is dependent on you transmitting this to other people. I think this is just direct, right? When you see, for example, like how discipline is being portrayed in media, for example, or these other things, you internalize directly to yourself and apply it into your own life. And it doesn't require the sort of intermediary of parents and other authority that is subject to a lot of different external forces that makes it like have no delta in this debate. So this is the most direct form of internalization and the most direct narrative that is important. Given that context, why is this narrative the most good for personal development? I think the first thing to point out is the burden on Gov is to defend a world with less of this narrative, because that is the burden of a this House opposes motion, which means that naturally other narratives tend to prop up because people just naturally want to seek for meaning, and also because other people just want something to believe in the way they want to approach meaning in their lives. The thing is, these other narratives tend to be things like the fact that you have to obtain capital, for example, because we live in a capitalist society in which we find meaning through things like the corporate rat race, or things like appearances and social validation, because that is the easiest way that we judge other people and assign value and meaning towards other people, and equally therefore to ourselves. Why is this narrative better compared to all these other things? The first thing to point out is that discipline is substantially within our own control, which means that you are able to take ownership over that discipline, and it is more fulfilling. But it is also more fair because discipline is largely about an individual's mindset and an individual approach to work, which they have substantially more control over, versus other things like the outcome of your work, which is often decided by the birth lottery or decided by, the way other people act and the way other people sort of do things at work, or the way other people achieve their own goals. Like, obviously, we will concede there's some variability in the discipline that you can put in, but it has to be comparative, right? It can at least be counterbalanced by your willpower, by your effort when you put effort into the things that you want to do. Secondly, this is just good because it is focused on the process rather than the end goal, which, as I pointed out, is subject to a lot of external influences. And thirdly, because discipline is not inherently tied towards any material good, which means it's a good in and of itself. And so sort of like the benchmark for that is not tied towards like whether or not you actually have a physical final result, but you can feel meaning even if you didn't get that final result. The final thing I want to do in this argument is to do a little bit of a trade-off and explain some things. Because obviously we agree that narratives can be exclusionary and some people might not be able to have as good discipline. The first thing to point out is that discipline is often a vague enough concept, which means that it can be personalized to a lot of people. It's about the mindset, it's about the attitude to your life, which means that there's a lot more flexibility to ensure that you don't go overboard with the amount of work that you put in, but you are still pushing yourself beyond just like narratives that say you need to be better than you were yesterday are probably just good narratives because it pushes yourself, even though pushes yourself to do better, while still not being like overly pushing yourself to the limit, right? But the second thing to point out is I think narratives can always tend to be exclusionary under their side of the house. Like, obviously, there are also narratives that are exclusionary, things like wealth, things like social acceptance that a lot of people cannot achieve. Before I move on to the tipping point, I'll take closing government.
If narratives like wealth is important, it exists on both sides of the house, why do the two not work together, i.e. you're rich because you were disciplined?
I don't think it matters whether or not they work together, right? The thing is, we just give a lot of people options because on your side of the house, they are stuck with the narrative of wealth. On our side of the house, some people who are wealthy are probably happy on either side of the house. Meanwhile, a lot of people who are not wealthy can at least access one half of the narrative, which is discipline, and therefore are still able to, for example, get the benefits of going to the gym every day or putting in the work every day to do things that they want to do. Our final thing is on the tipping point. I think perseverance and discipline, even if these are exclusionary narratives, is just generally an objectively good value to cultivate in a young age, right? Because oftentimes it does correlate with the end results you get. I think it's a good thing if we push people to be productive because it means they're contributing more to their work, more to their society, but it also means that they're pushing themselves to be better people and, for example, gaining more things that lead to them having a better life. This is by far the maximum utility argument in this debate because it impacts people in everyday form of life. It applies to every goal that you want to achieve in your life. It applies to every aspiration that you have. And it by far outweighs what we hear from opening government, who say like, okay, this only applies to like a very specific context of children and parents. Our argument clearly applies to by far a majority of cases in which any person has like a goal or has like, an aspiration in their life. For those reasons, very proud to stand in opening opposition.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and now I call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible? Okay, so once again, I'm going to disappoint Matt, just to make a little bit of an announcement. I would really like to thank Ricky. This has been a really, really nice tournament. I know we could draw, and that's why I want to make sure that this is clear. Matt says this makes it more likely for judges to think you will drop, but I'm sure you're fair. Okay, also really, really nice to be debating teams that are really fun. I like CG and CO as well. Obviously, CO are close friends of mine. Oh, good speech. All right, I will start in a second. And of course, I'll take CO. Of course, I'll take CO. Because I love CO, but also Diagonal Clash. Okay. As a kid, I could not sit still in class at all. And it's not just me, it's actually roughly 10 to 12% of the population right now has things like ADHD. Some of them have depression, some of them have issues with authority. And I don't think this is a small stakeholder. And we're going to talk about this and we want to make it clear. This isn't cultural. This is often true in American society as well. You see the image of a perfect family where children listen to their parents and then fathers feel bad if their son is acting in a way that isn't legitimate for them. And so they get embarrassed and discipline him. Of course, the point is that if you oppose a narrative, presumably the narrative is strong in places like cultures in India or China, right? And of course, those cultures could change without this glorification. Of course, the extent of that culture might not change that much if Op can analyze lots of reasons you want discipline, but then the benefit of the glorification is also quite low. So I just want to point out the glorification has a big impact on how much these people perceive it and the alternative chances of it. And if OO is correct on liberalization, we make it go faster. So just with that clarification, I want to talk about two things. First, let's talk about the case itself. What happens to children? What's the trade-off? And why is it the most important thing in the debate? Then I'll do direct responses to OO and take them out. First, on the parent-child relationship. Note that on opposition, in instances where people discipline you, the reason they constantly harm you is because the easiest way to make a child feel like they're being heard or not, like listen to you, is to restrict things they already have, because it's the fastest thing you can do. It takes a lot less time than buying something for them, going out and actually giving it to them. And like Ricky points out, you can't constantly give them ice cream. They'll get used to the ice cream. And then restricting that ice cream is a very immediate thing you can take away from them much more quickly. So what happens to parent-child relationships? First, children became very scared of their parents on this side. The reason for this is because they're so ashamed of the idea that they didn't listen to them, because their own identity is based on discipline. The kids around them make fun of them when they don't listen to the teacher, and they're laughed at in class for not continuing to stay silent and listen to what they're saying, and they feel like they're going to be socially attacked for it. But second, the short-term consequences are tangible. It's not just the fact that you get your video games taken away from you. It's a sinking feeling in your gut that dad and mom are disappointed and I'm a bad person, and it makes you feel sad because you don't want to disappoint people that you look up to. At that point, often what happens is simple. First, when children do end up doing stupid things, like say getting into a relationship which they did not control because of hormones and stupid decisions, which O seems to agree will happen, often they don't tell their parents. They go to a party without telling them, they hide it from them, and often they're even more scared of telling them what happens because of the consequences, even when it does occur, so they don't reach out to them for help. The impact of this is intense and enough to win a lot of this debate. So the first thing is that discipline means that you might do things less often, but when you do, they get significantly worse because you don't tell your parents you tried a little bit of drugs and perhaps now you have an actual problem with the law and you don't want them to know it. While if you told your parents when you had less fear of discipline, often you might tell them a little bit. You might tell them perhaps you went to a party, and they might probe deeper and ask you why you're upset, and you'll be less scared of that shame. So you learn how to deal with the situations preemptively. The impact of this is when obviously children are younger, they do less bad things. They often do things that aren't as extreme. So their parents will talk to them. For example, you shouldn't have gone to that kid's house when I told you, and now they know they can talk to their parents with empathy, and hence they realize in the future they shouldn't do this preemptively because the reasons will be explained to them and their parents feel like they care for them. But second, they tell them when things go wrong, so they fix this in the future. They reach out to their parents in the future. But third, they don't hate their parents. There's something Ricky points out that I don't think O responds to. They get scared of the fact that their parents are causing them harm, and often because the parents are busy, they have jobs to do, they only have so much time to spend with their kids. Often all the interactions with their parents feel like you have to stick to a certain rule set, and if you fail it, then you won't be loved by them. At which point you don't even talk to your parents that much about things that happen. The impact of this is things like trauma, depression, horrible relationships that end in terrible breakups because no one told you to get out of it in the first place, drugs that actually kill you because you went to the party without telling anyone and then you're lost. These are intense impacts that happen quite often because children are very, very vulnerable. vulnerable, and they often are in dangerous situations. The second thing I want to point out is the feeling of disappointment, right? So I told you the impact of this on stakeholders is large because there's a lot of people who just cannot be disciplined. If you have ADHD, it's difficult for you to continue listening to orders and staying in place and not talking because it just comes out of you. And as a kid, you don't have control over it. On our side, the counterfactual is that without glorification, other narratives take the space. So often, if you think about this psychologically, right? If you're in a class intuitively, often there's 3 or 4 kids who just don't listen, right? They just refuse to care about what the teacher says. So it's a pretty large amount of people. The problem then is that those kids are going to be portrayed in media as the troublemakers and you glorify those who are disciplined. On our side, probably if you don't glorify it, often you talk about how discipline is good, fine, but you also talk about these other kids and write stories about how they can be solved in terms of their mental issues. You can talk to them, you can make them feel better. On the other hand, on our side, these kids will double down because they feel like no one does care about them and they feel guilty and intensely bad. This is bad because of the self-esteem issues this causes long into the future. So later, when their boss tells them they aren't doing a good job or don't deserve good pay, it impacts into the opening opposition claim. Because if kids feel like their lack of discipline is the problem, then often they grow up expecting less respect from other people unless they can solve a problem that they never could in the first place. And they feel like it's their fault, so they blame themselves and feel increasingly guilty, which makes them also worse in other types of frequent interactions they have with other people. They're more willing to accept insults because they just see themselves as a bad person. They're more willing to not talk to their parents when that happens, and their lives get worse. This is a large stakeholder with an intense impact, and it impacts into their future. It affects their workplace and how bosses talk to them because they really idolize the authority. The third and most obvious impact is if this culture is created, you keep glorifying it, and people compete on it, then obviously it gets worse in other forms of like work as well. So in the workplace, the productivity that OO talks about is symmetric. The reason for this is direct rebuttal. The first one is that obviously being disciplined and controlling your time is good for you as a worker, so you're given tools as well as incentives to do this, and hence you learn this eventually. But in instances where it goes too far, the boss tells you to do something that isn't good, the boss tells you to spend too much time for you, you don't speak out at all, which makes it easier for people with power and money to actually exploit you, which impacts into flipping the old claim, because productivity is something every company wants, hence you're fed this narrative very often. But discipline is something when you've been taught as a kid is so valuable, you don't even question what the boss says. So you might make bad decisions that fuck you over, but the boss obviously won't take the blame for that, because even if discipline is valued, the boss can come up with better excuses and you can't. But the final point about this is about how this affects other people and minorities in general life. Before that, Amsio?
Can you explain to me, in your own words, what the difference is between the narrative that one should obey one's parents and this narrative?
No. You should obey your parents. That's the narrative. The difference is that glorification says that it's such a good thing that it makes you an incredible person, while on our side, you only obey your parents when you think that it's absolutely something you care about, and you disobey them when it's extreme enough that you just don't think you can handle it. Like maybe you really want a relationship. At that point, I think most kids will obey their parents in most cases, but this is about instances where they just cannot or they don't want to. Okay, the final thing is about how kids affect other kids, right? So if you're beating someone up in school or you're doing bad things to other people, the discipline narrative isn't really relevant because like other people will call you out because their kids are being harmed and hence your bad actions are caught. The problem now is that you don't reach out to these kids. You don't talk to the kids who are feeling upset because they're literally seen as socially stigmatized and bad human beings. You don't feel like the solution is to talk to them but to discipline them, which makes them feel even worse. And they double down in their activities. They bully more people because they've been punished so many times. On our side, when those kids are given a bit more leeway, their parents have loved them for a long part of their lives. But when they do get punished, it really hits hard and they think about it and people actually talk to them and help them solve those problems. So if you want to stop bullies, you want to give them an opportunity to understand why what they did was wrong. But if you constantly give them this conditioning, then often what they feel like is that the only way they can continue living is to just live with the situation they're in as bad human beings and continue taking those actions because they give up on their parents' validation because they can't get it. So I think it's the most certain impact. It affects people throughout their lives. Won't someone think of the kids?
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and to close the first half of this debate, I call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay, I'll take PYs in chat. I think OO's conception of humanity is overly optimistic in a world where discipline doesn't exist. Because what we told you was not that people should always do things that are consistently productive or consistently good, but that otherwise people overwhelmingly don't want to do things that in the long run will provide them genuine fulfillingness, genuine meaning, and learn things that we think are genuinely good for them. Which is why I think OO's main comparative, which was one where people still follow the orders of their parents, except when it's kind of inconvenient to them, kind of destroys the way in which they're able to actualize any sort of change on their side of the house. Because the point is that kids don't know when things are good for them. They don't know when to best follow these things on their side, which is why we think discipline is important when it comes to these situations in either world. So I'll break this debate down on two levels. First, I'll engage directly with OG again in terms of the parent-child relationship and why we think at best it's very slightly worse and at worst it's probably better on our side. And second, I'll outweigh by focusing on our material, which we didn't get much response with, but I'll respond to the things that they did talk about. Firstly, on the parent-child relationship, the first thing I want to do is explore the underlying mechanisms OG gives as to why people are able to internalize this message of discipline in such a harmful way. They say three things. Firstly, they say parents become authority figures. Second, that social expectations make it so that you want your child to follow rules. And third, that children are expected to stay quiet, follow orders, and do what's best for them. The first thing I want to point out is a lot of these narratives are often existing in an arena where other narratives exist that independently make parents want to do these things anyways. And insofar as parents are remaining authority figures, as was conceded by DPM, it's really unclear the extent to which you're actually able to get these empathetic discussions they talk about on their side of the house, right? So for example, I have ADHD. My parents don't think I had ADHD for a long time. And, regardless of whether or not I believe I'm disciplined or not, I mean, I'm 18 now, I can have adult conversations with them. So like OG's argument doesn't apply that much. The point is that insofar as they never view these things as being important in the first place, they'll never want to listen to me on these things in the first place. So if the underlying reasons for why parents want to control their kids, i.e. disagree with them over some religious view or disagree with them over some liberal view, occur on either side of the house, the point is kids are going to want to rebel on either side of the house if it's extreme, and on either side of the house, discipline isn't going to be the margin by which you're able to change these things. Secondly, and I think more microscopically, OG really underestimates the other ways in which parents want to take care of their kids, right? So while I think it's true that parents on our side of the house are pushed to want to create rules and are pushed to want to teach their kids more, which I'll prove later why it's a good thing, I think this also still comes with some cognizance of the fact that they were once children themselves, that they know what it's like growing up in households, for example, where you're not given as much freedom and what that may or may not mean for you in the future. And that means, because I think OG agrees that parents almost overwhelmingly care about their kids and care about them to such a significant extent that in a lot of situations you're willing to sort of neuter the extent to which you discipline them or tailor your discipline to the specific needs of your children, right? So if you're someone who believes, for example, that, like mental health is a serious thing, and I think my generation as we parent will believe that, but still want to discipline your kids as is socially encouraged on our side of the house, that is the point at which you probably do things that are slightly different from other parents. And note, it wasn't enough for there just to be social expectations that you sort of control your kid, because the point at which these social expectations, first of all, because I think the protectiveness that parents have over their children sort of contradicts these social expectations, which is why, for example, when teachers are often really overbearing on children, parents often intervene and protect them. So that means that the extent to which you're competing against other social factors of discipline as a child is also the point at which you have protection from them. So I don't think it's as significant as they talk about. What I think is important, though, is that many times kids themselves, because they're myopic and don't understand what's best for them, and this is genuinely true, right? Even if you feel as if you understand what's best for you, often means that you make really, really dumb decisions a lot of the time. And note, I think while it's equally likely, as I mentioned, that on either side of the house, extreme behavior is encouraged, that if on our side of the house, parents are more likely to tell you from day zero that smoking weed is bad, as exists in most East Asian cultures, for example, growing up in Hong Kong, I know this, you probably will never engage in that activity for the most part because you view that activity as being generally bad. And it was entirely unclear why the pressure of really wanting to do something was going to overweigh this conditioning, if it is the case that this conditioning seems to work by their own concession in the vast majority of cases. So what OG is left with is extremes that happen on either side of the house because you don't know what's best for you, and you encounter rare situations in which you want to pursue something so badly that you pursue them. And some cases in which you're better off on our side of the house because you would have otherwise not done these things that are genuinely harmful to you when you're a child, for example, and you learn from them. The final thing to say is, and Dazzle mentions this, but we get no response, is just that you grow out of these things over time, right? So it's not enough for them to just assert trauma, but I think it's that over time, the things that you saw benefit you, that you see other kids are not benefited by, empower you in ways that is genuinely meaningful, right? You feel as if it was good that you were able to, follow your parents' orders and so on, which is why many times later on, even in East Asian communities, in Asian communities, you end up getting closer to your family as you grow older. And that's a big reason for that. The second thing I want to do then is engage with our comparative. Does CG have a POI before that?
Oji?
Yeah, sure.
The thing about personal discipline and the value of controlling your time is that often companies will always tell you to be careful with it, but they won't tell you to listen to exactly how your boss tells you to do it, which means you get all the benefits of feeling like you're doing a good process, but you've designed the process and you found one that fits you better. Doesn't this make your catharsis thing a lot less likely because bosses don't always know what's good for you?
So the point is that I think to enable catharsis in the first place, you need to be willing to engage in things that are genuinely motivating and good for you, right? So it takes a certain amount of discipline, for example, for me to go to the gym for an extended period of time and benefit from that. It takes a certain amount of discipline, for example, for me to work hard and study over the summer and learn things that are going to enable me to be smarter or better in the future. Those things don't otherwise exist on your side. So it's not even a matter of your boss giving you the space to grow, because that space to grow never actually happens when we don't encourage discipline in the first place. And note, I'm not spending much time on this because we didn't get much response, but I do think it is more important than any of their material about children. Firstly, because it applies to way more people in way more instances of life. Second, because I think it shapes the way in which people genuinely interact with meaning and impose meaning on their lives. And more importantly, because they no longer impose meanings in the way that CG POI'd, i.e. through like wealth and stuff, that it is better on our side of the house that you feel meaning just by doing certain things and engaging in certain activities. So that's overall better for society. I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and now to open the second half of this debate, I call on the Member of Government. Here. the speaker very much for this very fine speech. Reminder that POIs are cool. Take them, please. And that being said, I call on the member of opposition. Here.
Can the stream be turned back on? Okay, let me know when it is. In the meanwhile, please only ask POIs in the chat, and try not to make facial grimaces, because those tend to trigger my stutter. So, done? Started? Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. The modern world is a dopamine prison. In closing opposition, we want to break free from the chains of our own weaknesses. But first, some weighing against top half. OG only focuses on parental discipline. This motion encompasses discipline as a concept more broadly. In closing opposition, we will analyze the emerging narrative of self-discipline that is encouraging young people to take control over their own destiny and revolt against the modern world. Secondly, on opening opposition is great at highlighting the benefits of discipline, but as DPM points out, they don't explain why you will be capable of achieving self-discipline, especially given all of the obstacles that OG poses. Therefore, we will prove 2 things in closing opposition. First, on why right now we live in a dopamine prison, so we need this narrative. And secondly, why growth is possible and why with this narrative you actually can make a change. How does the modern world look like? First, note human biology. We are wired evolutionarily to prioritize short-term gratification over long-term gratification. Why is this the case? It is because we need to react immediately for survival. So when we encounter things like sugar, which gives us a lot of calories, we want to eat it as soon as possible, because evolutionarily this could help us survive. But in the modern world, sugar is overabundant, which means we have a cognitive bias in favor of overeating and things like that. Secondly, often when we are stressed, like when we are at work and have a hard shift, we activate a fight or flight instinct, by which we immediately want to relieve the pain. So we go for dopamine hits that are available for us, such as smoking a cigarette or going for unhealthy food. But note that consumerism amplifies this, because companies appeal to your base instincts to sell your products. This looks like in the modern world, you're flooded with short-term gratification content on social media. You have advertisements for things like entertainment videos, for social media pages that give you brain rot. You're constantly rationed this content again and again so that you're stuck in dopamine cycles. And these things are like base primal instincts. Like even you have ads for pornographic content and things like that. And food manufacturers pack foods with sugary foods and things like that. Note that even AI algorithms are able to mine your data to see how to perniciously market things to you that are the most likely products that you're going to buy. This leads to long-term regret, because even though these things may be good for you in the short run, they waste your time and they lead to brain fog, because you're not doing the things that align with your long-term goals and how you see yourself as a person. You just do what feels right in the moment, but you miss out on your long-term goals. You want to read 10 books this year, but instead you just wasted your time watching YouTube videos. You really want to go to that college of your dreams, but instead you just kept succumbing to your addictions. This leads to you not being able to achieve your goals, but it also leads to guilt and self-hate. You feel like you're a slave to your desires, and that you're not able to achieve the things that you actually want to achieve. This is the harm that exists exclusively in the status quo, which is why we direly need a counter narrative to fight against this. How does this counter narrative looks like? I think closing government is right to say that this largely comes from conservative spaces where you have movements by which they tell you need to revolt against the influences of the modern world, but also business incentives that tell people who want to be productive. So there's an incentive, a market demand. How can I be more productive? So more content is generated for this. So how does this manifest? A couple of points. Firstly, you have more how-to guides that help you to develop discipline if you want to, because this narrative is more popular, so there are more communities about this online, so there is an incentive to make more content. For example, in regards to OG, now you have more videos about how to study effectively if you have ADHD, how you can develop discipline even if you have a mental health condition and things of that nature. You have videos that tell you how you can eat healthier more cheaply if you want to, how to shop for healthy food if you are poor and things of this nature, how to bulk if you're extremely skinny, which equips you with the tools to become self-disciplined in the first place. But secondly, and this engaged with CG, there are more accountability groups online because you find communities with other people who are trying to be disciplined. Because as CG says, you are going to relapse and this is difficult. Note that these communities check on each other if you are progressing or not, because groups have an incentive to be successful altogether. So groups which encourage you when you relapse to actually be okay with it, to accept it and start being disciplined again are groups that thrive. And this is particularly useful because you're a social animal. And when you have an accountability group, someone who checks in on you and says, oh, have you been playing Baldur's Gate for the entire weekend? Maybe we should go out and hiking. This motivates you because you want to be part of the entire tribe that does something good for you. But thirdly, shame is sometimes good. CG says that it's bad when certain people are shamed, but know that East Asian countries are the countries with the lowest rate of obesity, and part of it is because this is extremely stigmatized there. Sure, overeating and relapsing might happen, but the worst situation is if the people around you encourage it. When you have indulgence culture like in the US, where people tell you that if you're seriously obese, it's just okay, it's just another expression, so this is much worse. We have accountability groups that can pick you up. Before I move on to my next mechanism, Shoria, go ahead.
When you feel, I'm Shaurya, not you. When you feel like you as a child weren't a good person because you weren't disciplined, you become much more scared of actually trying to be disciplined because you feel like you're a bad person, which makes all of this much harder as you grow older and feel like you can't even talk to your parents.
So you're scared. So on your side of the house, or rather on your side of the house, you're scared. But when you see that there are successful groups, this is what inspires you to get out of the rut, and we enable this exclusively from CO per our characterization. Thirdly, this narrative manifests in inspirational role models. There are a lot of videos, especially in the Dude Bro YouTube, where you have goals or people to whom you look up to. For example, the character of Guts from Berserk is a warrior who is disabled. He doesn't have an eye and an arm, and he was raped as a child. He started in a position of extreme weakness, but over time he gained strength, which means that once you consume media like this, even if you're weak right now, if you're not meeting your goals right now, you believe that one day you can become strong. Why is this important? Because then you value incremental growth. Even if you achieve a micro goal, like you're not shredded yet, but you can do 10 more reps of push-ups than you did a month ago, you feel like you're progressive towards something, which leads to a positive feedback loop. You believe in yourself more. I was able to achieve a micro goal. In 5 years, I can achieve a bigger goal, which means you hate yourself less, which inspires you to work more in the future. But more importantly than this, you're able to endure pain. You're okay with pain because you don't indulge in your addictions as much. So even though you feel terrible, you don't smoke that cigarette. Even though you don't feel like going to class, you push yourself to go to class even though you don't feel like it, which leads to two main impacts. You don't hate yourself and you're actually able to achieve your own goals. I'm very happy to win from closing opposition.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech. And now to close the case for said government, I call on the government whip here.
While Jason's getting ready, I also want to apologize for speaking over Shaurya. I genuinely did not hear a team name or like personal name called. My bad.
Can I be heard? Perfect. Okay. The problem with the case we got from CO is that it's not actually about the glorification of discipline. It's just a lot of reasons as to why discipline is really good and help you live a better life. We told you that specifically what glorification is likely to mean is to say that this is the only way for you to live a moral life, that you ought to do the same thing over and over again, that you ought to be in that Sigma male grind set in order to be the best version of yourself. Their version of discipline was one that was incredibly soft. We were the only ones that debated the motion. Two paths to victory for closing government. The first on your ability to access goals. We specifically told you that the version of glorifying discipline on their side of the in this debate is likely to be one that prioritizes things like individualism. The reason as to why is because you see all of these icons on social media. You see people like Jordan Peterson, who's endured all of the pain of like doing an only meat diet and always tells you how good that is for him. You see people like David Goggins, who's always doing his Navy SEAL training and running like 6 miles a day, and you see that I ought to be someone like this. The important thing here is that these narratives often map on things like conservative narratives that already exist, i.e. you ought to, the best version of yourself is one that you do not have, where you do not have to rely on others, and the fact that you see these singular figures and these singular role models means that that is more likely to be the case. But secondly, we told you that you're likely to be seen as, in the cases in which you do slip up and you're not 100% maximize discipline, you're likely to be seen as a moral failing, that this is a personal fault for you. What is the comparative here? There's likely some level of discipline on both sides of the house. That is to say, things like working hard, like providing a better health for you is likely good, and at the point in which there's probably more information that's circulating in the status quo, we think that there's an incredibly small delta on this. The difference is you're likely to shame individuals who do not live up to that benchmark in the first place. That's incredibly important because it actually deters individuals from wanting to be disciplined and wanting to do the things like OO does, because if I'm someone who's watching David Goggins and I'm like, I could never run 6 miles a day, that's the point in which I am likely to opt out. I want to be clear on how this material functions in this debate. First, against opening government, because I think this proves that you're likely to map discipline onto other bad narratives in debate, or bad narratives in society, i.e. your value and your fulfillment is contingent on things like wealth. This is especially true when people like social media influencers like Jordan Peterson want to appeal to the broadest audience, and they themselves tell you that these narratives are likely to be incredibly pervasive. The difference then is that on their side of the house, you're told that things like wealth disparities and other types of disparities are due to things like personal failures, which means it shuts out other types of narratives that say that there are exogenous factors as to why things like wealth inequality exist in the first place, which means that even if these bad narratives exist regardless, they make them much, much worse and much harder to resist. But secondly, how does this interact with the extension from closing opposition? First, it flips their claim because we would say that you feel even more helpless when you think that you cannot reach that level of discipline that your favorite social media influences are reaching in the first place, which means that you're more likely to fail. This is especially true when people like Jordan Peterson are likely to sensationalize this as much as possible, and the media are as well. This person did this really hard, really, really extreme thing. Look what they did. You should do that too. That's incredibly bad because the benchmark here is simply too high. Even if these steps getting there are incredibly good, closing closing opposition never reaches those steps in the first place, because your instinctual result from seeing these or seeing this when you're like way behind that benchmark of David Goggins, you're likely to just give up and fail. But secondly, on their claim about accountability groups, this is also likely to be incredibly bad. First, we would say that there's still likely accountability on our side. If anything, it's a lot better because you deprioritize narratives of individualism on our side of the house, which means that you're more likely to seek help in the first place. So even if these groups exist on their side, the propensity for individuals to access them is far less, because you think that the reason why you're not succeeding in your goals is your fault and you shouldn't have to seek out help. What you get on their side is a very toxic version of accountability, where one, you're likely to shame individuals from not achieving the extreme goal that is likely to be shown as the most important, but secondly, that individuals are not likely to access these in the first place because they see it as a personal failing. The bottom line here is that we agree that a dopamine prison probably exists. However, we provide a far better way of addressing these things insofar as there's an incentive for things like coming together on both sides of the house, but on their side, that incentive is incredibly toxic and you antagonize those who do not meet the benchmark that you're likely to meet. Before going on, I'll take opening.
If you burn out all the time, you can't show up the next day for work. So since discipline is about a consistent process, like going to the gym 3 times a week, surely the narrative will support things like rest and pushing yourself to a reasonable limit in order to maintain discipline.
Right. I was actually going to start talk about this in my second path to victory, right? Because I think the important distinction of what glorification of discipline actually looks on their side is not just doing things like pursuing personal progress and pursuing your goals. It's also things like doing the singular goal over and over and over and again. So even if things like mental health are prioritized on their side of the house, it's not the specific act that might be the most dangerous. It's the fact that you're doing the same thing over and over again. That is why at the point in which you're less likely to do things like take risks on their side of the house, or you're more likely to be locked into a system in which you're doing the same thing. That actually causes burnout, because even if the things that they talk about opposition wants are productive in the first place, you're not actually likely to reach that point The reason as to why is because intrinsically the reason as to why people find fulfillment in life is when they find instances of velocity, when life slows down and speeds up, when they find variety in their lives in different types of experiences. On their side of the house, the version of glorifying discipline is a narrative that says you ought to focus on one singular goal and set aside every single other small thing that you might care about in order to maximize outcomes. We thought that was uniquely likely to burn out. How does this position against the arguments from other teams? First, against opening opposition. First, you are not likely to pursue these goals that they want in the long term at the point in which you're likely to be burnt out in the first place. But secondly, that the goals that they want are likely unfulfilling for a lot of people. Maybe they are productive in the sense that you get more money, but I think the things that actually make a person's life fulfilling, i.e. variety and velocity, are far less on their side of the house. So even if you're more productive, you're not as happy. Secondly, against opening government. First of all, this extension functions in a far greater variety of cases, i.e. not just societies where authoritarian parents exist. I think their argument is probably not very comparative here. But secondly, because it doesn't matter if kids are dumb or smart, or if parents are good or bad, if the version of the life that they're trying to promote is one that is inherently burnt out, one that is inherently non-fulfilling. We beat the other teams, first on OG because they're not comparative, and the cases that they analyze are too small. We beat OO because the version of discipline that they analyze is bad, and we beat CO because their extension doesn't account for the fact that you antagonize individuals who do not have discipline. On those grounds, incredibly proud to stand on closing government.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and to close the debate as a whole, I call on the opposition whip.
Every day of our lives is a struggle against the cross trying to weigh you down into the ground. But as you carry this cross, you grow stronger. You grow more able to carry it. Even if the cross grows, so do you. And in the end, you carry it to the end, and you look back at your life and you realize that you lived a good life. On the comparative, you are stuck in the dopamine prison and you never achieve the goals that you have on both sides of the house. Let's go with a little bit of clarification that destroys most of the CG case. The goals, such as having the body of David Beckham or becoming the president of America, are independent on whether or not you glorify the discipline. You glorify this because this is something that you desire, because this is something that fulfills your personal ambition, because this is something that you have a personal interest in. But on our side of the house, you are uniquely equipped with the capacity to achieve those goals. Why is that the case? Because one, as Robbie explained to you, the way that this is manifesting is that it helps you to valorize the small goals and to understand them as a part of a journey towards the greater future. Maybe you do not have the body of David Beckham after 2 months of workout, but you see that your weight has dropped from 82 to 81, and this is progress. You see that your muscles are starting to become more defined when you send a picture to your accountability buddy who you sometimes work out with, because you help each other become better and you help each other reach your personal goals. What this implies is that one, even if you do not fulfill the end goal, which again, most people will not fulfill their end goals, I think it's a reasonable concession that we can make. Like most people's end goal are over ambitious. Then you are at least achieving something, and you are at least feeling like you haven't rotted in bed your best years, and like you have improved your life somewhat. But two, you are happy with what you achieved to much more of an extent, because you kind of knew already that your initial goal was kind of unrealistic, and that you're keeping it up like as the kind of star that you aim towards, because that star is what motivates you, because that star is what inspires you and helps you to go through with this glorification of discipline, equips you with the capacity to actually achieve this, equips you with the mental fortitude to, even if it's raining, even if it's like really hot, even if you're feeling terrible, you still go up, you still work out, and in a month's time you're going to see the effects. In 2 months' time you're going to see even better effects, and this is going to keep you on the track, make you much more helped. That's why against opening government to some degree. I think opening government tried to restrict this debate to a context within which it doesn't apply exclusively, which is not the exclusive context of this debate. And I think that they do have a strong proof that to some degree, some people are going to be alienated from this narrative. I think that it's sufficient to beat most of the opening opposition material. What it doesn't deal with is the fact that this accountability culture grows as you age and helps people as the time goes on, especially counteracting the sins of modernity that we are facing every single day right now, e.g. the fact that we are trapped in the dopamine prison by the overwhelming consumerist narrative that is trying to trap us into consuming mindlessly, because that is easier for the kind of capitalistic system to do, because then again you spend money, you consume, and this is much easier than if you were trying to actually just like unplug a little bit and focus on yourself to some degree and focus on actually achieving your goals, rather than buying a next pack of cigarettes to give yourself a rest day because you deserved it, because whatever. What this means is that one, the case needs to be seen, like, we need to see this in terms of the weighing of it. Why is the kids not going to be that important in this debate? Number one, because it is still dependent to some degree on the culture around raising kids being bad inherently. E.g., the examples that opening government gives aren't necessarily dependent on good or bad discipline glorification. They are dependent on whether or not the parent is a quality parent. And I think that it's fair to say that this narrative can help parents to be worse when they are already bad, but this already mitigates to some degree their impact that they're claiming. Why is that the case? Because most of the bad parents are not going to be great on either side of the world. Bad liberal parents are in fact even worse than bad disciplined parents, because maybe the bad disciplined parents are going to give you some degree of trauma and force you to rebel to some degree. But I think that the case of, you going to a party and with drugs and dying from the drug overdose is really extreme. The more likely case is that, you're probably going to have a childhood during which you rebel to some degree, you go to parties, etc. But in the end, you default back to the narrative that have been imposed upon you as you mature and as you grow. And I think that this is to some degree the unweaponized version of this is the weaponized version of the OO case, because OO case that just tells you this is going to happen, trust us. We are telling you, here's the mechanisms for which you actually internalize this narrative later on in your life. Here's why you default back to this narrative. Here's why the comparative is so much worse. Absent this narrative, you're unable to access any of those, and absent the kind of the narrative of glorification, you're not able to get all of the resources that you need in order to achieve your goals. E.g., we are a strong capacity extension over opening opposition. Opening opposition has a smart idea. The problem with their idea is the execution of capacity. They are able to prove the incentive. They are not able to beat the challenges from OG, e.g., this is going to be really badly done. This is not going to be able to allow growth. This is not going to be sufficient in terms of actually allowing you to go through. We beat them and therefore beat opening opposition on engagement. But two, we also beat them quality of analysis, because opening opposition just let me just run through some of their arguments directly so that I don't seem uncharitable. Okay. They tell you that you as a kid are myopic. You as a child, don't understand that the parents mean well for you. And, all of this is great if the parents are actually, meaning very well and aren't as myopic as the children themselves are. But I don't think that this is really where the crux of this debate lies. I don't think that the crux of this debate is myopia and not being understanding of your parent. I think that the crux of this debate is achievement of your personal goals, which is also the framing that I think is the strongest here, because again, it's about whether or not you can achieve those goals. OO tries to claim that you fulfill personal goals, but they miss the burdens on explaining why this actually helps and why this is sufficient, especially considering the pushback about how this rebels you against discipline and makes you more selfish, more rebellious, and more unhelpful towards your own goals. Opening, what do you have for me?
Look, a lot of companies will want you to manage your time, like we said, to make you an efficient worker. But a lot of parents, when they overwhelmingly do this because they feel like the only way to control their kids is discipline, cause really bad experiences. Everyone was a kid. This is also something that affects everyone for decades of their life.
Yeah, and I think that this is where a little bit of your case falls out to some degree. I still think you have quite strong responses as for why this narrative is not going to be, what's it called, taken in well enough. But the problem is that part of your case is reliant on the conception that you have to discipline your kids in a specific way, which is independent on this narrative. And in fact, this narrative can be to some degree a counter to this, because I think that at the point where we are focusing specifically on the positivity of the glorification and not on the negativity of the punishment and the negativity of the lack of discipline, we are helping those people to understand that you do not have to just scream at your child and, shout at them. You can just make it something that is achievable. You can make it something that is great. And I think that this is where the kind of authoritarian bias culture, I don't want to be dismissive, but I don't think that this debate debate applies as broadly as you guys claim, and especially does not apply in cultures in which different parenting cultures exist. And again, this just might be a cultural gap, but I don't think that this is a universal case from opening government at all. Second, this is not implied in the motion. We do not have to stand behind the worst cases of discipline from the parents. And I think that lots of the case from OG is actually a worst case scenario, especially considering the fact that opening government already says that this narrative exists because the companies want you to be productive, which means that they're probably going to discipline you towards being productive, whether or not you glorify the discipline yourself. So proud to oppose.